Hello, class. This is ED 8780, and as you know, this class talks primarily about school boards and school superintendents. And so today we're going to dive into what is part of the next three sessions, in which we talk specifically about what boards can and what boards should do, and also to help you have a better understanding of the difference between management or governance. And so we'll talk about those. And that's provided. There we go. This section of the course is going to talk specifically about boards. And school boards are kind of a frustrating thing at times, but they're also a very necessary thing. So as we study this section, you're going to find that every board is different. Some superintendents feel like they have the greatest boards. Some superintendents will tell you they had a great board until the election. And then when the new school board members come on, changes things dramatically. And you realize that they often get rid of a superintendent if they've run a successful campaign, especially on the idea of changing superintendents. So it's a lot to think about. The book that we're using is called Reform Governance, and it's one of my favorite books. What school boards can do. And you bought this, you should have a copy. If you don't, I'm going to tell you that you really need a copy of this. So make sure you get one, because as a superintendent, you will need it. What school boards can do, by Donald R. McAdams. Let me just read this. Reform governance, in short, is governance for a purpose, not just governance as a process. It brings together process, urban district reform knowledge, and it doesn't just have to be an urban district, but that's primarily what Don's experience is. It's primarily what my experience is as well. So it brings together process, urban district reform knowledge, and board leadership for the purpose of creating high-performing school districts. Now, sometimes people get the idea that a school district can only be successful if they're small. And sometimes when you look at the statistics and the data, it says, well, smaller districts, smaller districts in particular, not just the young ones, but are much more effective than big districts. Well, I'm going to tell you that a lot of that has to do with the school board. So we're going to talk about them. First thing we have to administratively answer to our satisfaction is, who's in charge of public schools? We think, well, we are. So what it comes down to, though, who makes the decisions, who's authorized by state law to make decisions, and what are the kinds of things that they can do in making decisions, then we know that there is some kind of balance of power. We happen to be at a point in time in our country where it's very difficult to tell what each branch of the government is responsible for. If you look at branches of government, we think of executive and legislative and judicial, and we like to think that one will check and balance the other, but that's not happening right now. And strangely enough, that goes right along with what happens in school boards. A lot of times, the people who are supposed to be in charge of schools, which would be the school boards, lose sight of what their purpose is, and they become immensely political. You know that there is a bill before the Indiana General Assembly right now talking about the fact that they want school board members to announce what political party they're from. I'm going to tell you that's a bad idea, just because we need to keep politics as much as possible out of school systems. Now you're going to say, but Schaefer, you talk so much about politics. That's right. Do I love politics? That's a great question. I think a better question is, do I feel like I need to know politics? And then I would answer yes. And I study politics profusely. I read a lot on the topic. Probably the number one thing I read about. I have helped to write 3 books on school boards and school school districts in charge? What do they do? And then also all the reform things and how do school boards react to that? So we're going to try to wrangle through these questions and hopefully it'll make a little more sense to you. Here's where the problem is. In American schools, everybody's in charge and really nobody's in charge. We elect or appoint school board members who have the purpose of being those who lead the school boards, but we don't realize that um, sometimes those boards don't have enough common sense or enough actual training to know what they're doing as a school board leader. So this first thing I would say, this is primarily a problem in the US because in most places of the world, a school board is either just a puppet show or they are hardcore, the group who runs the school district, and they don't accept any ideas or thoughts or sharing from the public or from the parents. So we talk a lot about theories of leadership and which works best for a democracy, what is stability. But I think it's also important to know that diffused power, which is power that's not held by one person, but actually is spread out to a whole group, and that's what happens to school boards and superintendents. The thing is great for democracy, but it really sucks when it comes to making decisions because when you have to get permission of this group and this group and this group and this group and this civic organization and the mayor and the county council and well, in Indiana, most school districts have nothing to do with their city or county council. They have very little contact with them. They compete for the same pool of money. However, it is not something that we spend a lot of time talking about. And but understand that any community, a school board is the governmental body that makes the decisions that will impact schools. Right or wrong, they're the ones in charge. So let's take a trip down memory lane really quickly. We're going to look at what about No Child Left Behind? You know that right now we're kind of, and this will date the video for future purposes, but I'm going to talk about it anyway. And that is No Child Left Behind came as a result of the federal government, which really realistically does not contribute that much to public education. And if you remember, constitutionally speaking, education is a function of the states. It is not a function of the US government. However, just like the government does with foreign countries, you know how our diplomacy works is that we give them X amount of dollars and then they give us favor. Now, there's a difference between favor and favors, but favor means that they look upon us kindly and grant our requests. Favors mean they do backdoor deals that are not good. So I think one of the things that we're looking at here is a lot of things in the world of education changed in 2002, a whole lot of things because of No Child Left Behind. Now, this is not really the time or place to spend much time talking about No Child Left Behind, but I think the overwhelming thing that we see is that it did not work. So the greatest period of time where we had the most top-down information being forced on us from the U.S. government, it was still a failure. And the one thing, and I have to say this is one good thing that I think came out of that, is that now we have this huge dependence on data. And we talk about data all the time. Before this, we really didn't talk much about data, just briefly. So unfortunately, though, we now have these demographic groups stuck in our head, and that's where they should stay, stuck in our heads, not interpreted out into the life of the school. And so when we talk about that, um, we figured out by saying we're going to report statistics on every single one of the demographic groups that we have. Now, I happen to believe, and my belief in this goes back to the fact that No Child Left Behind was created by ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council. They created it. They gave the wording to the U.S. Department of Education and to um, then President George W. Bush, who wanted the Texas miracle, which when you look at it now, it wasn't that much of a miracle, to be fulfilled for every state. And so it was a nonpartisan effort. There were major leaders on both sides. The idea was we're going to improve our schools. So sometimes you can look at things and say, yeah, that was great. That really transformed everything. Other times you can say it did not work. So as McAdams said, today's districts must educate all children to high levels, not only because it's the right thing to do, but also because it's essential for our economy and our democracy. Well, I like that, and when this particular book came out, I was working for Fort Wayne Community Schools. The vision or mission statement that we had is we educate all students to high standards. And I think that it's a great approach to feel like we need. So if we take that as our foundation, how do we then get school boards and the superintendent to work together? Sometimes people who spend a lot of time talking about school boards have the idea that the superintendent doesn't matter. Anybody can be the superintendent. Um, when I used to teach motorcycle safety classes, one of the owner of the program always said, there are some instructors and coaches that are so bad, I might as well set a pop bottle out there and let them give feedback because they're going to get better feedback from that pop bottle than they are from a person. And sometimes we get that idea about superintendents. But understand that a school board without a superintendent cannot function. And a superintendent should not function without a good board. And the question that comes up is, how do I take the board that I have now? Because that's how you start, is with the board you have now. How do I turn that into the powerhouse that I need it to be, making sure that that school board is accomplishing everything it's supposed to accomplish? And so we're going to be talking about reform boards. And I think that's a good place to start in many of the Indiana school districts. Now, I'm going to read this. I try hard not to read everything. It's on one of the, that it's on the slide, but some of this is really good. You may want to go ahead and run this off and keep a copy of this. But of course, it's right in your book that you should have purchased. And I'll show that again, what school boards can do. So most school boards operate under direct democratic control. An elected board appoints the superintendent as budget authority, some taxing authority, and ownership and responsibility for facilities and everything else. Although constrained by federal and state law, the board is the trustee for the people and directly governs the district. In many districts, boards share some governance power, especially budget and taxing, with city councils or other local elected bodies. And in some district boards, members are appointed. I will never forget the time when I was interviewing for school systems in the state of Tennessee. The school boards there are very interesting. Your whole process of applying for the superintendency is public. Everything that's done is public. It's done at a public board meeting where they interview you, and there may be 150, 200 people. One district that I applied to, I actually had relatives there, and it was the area that my mother had grown up in. And the building that was that time being used by this school board as the school board meeting, her classroom, where she attended second grade, was right down the hall from where this interview was taking place. It didn't help me to get the job, though. So understand the governance springs either directly or indirectly from the people. So either it's because the school boards take that authority and that power to do things, or it's given to them in a mandate by the people saying that this is something that has to be done. Remember that governance is always shared. By that, I mean that you cannot govern as one person, and understand that in this kind of situation where you have governance and management, governance must control management. So as a superintendent, understand you are going to be under the direct control of a school board. That's why superintendents will tell you they spend most of their time actively keeping the board happy. So as McAdams said, school boards and superintendents are partners, but not equal partners. School boards govern, superintendents manage. Now, that's kind of getting us to where we want to go with this. Something for you to think about. And I think this is good. It's always good for us to think about these things. What happens when the school board stops governing and starts managing? They start putting their fingers into things that are not their business. The thing that you have to do is not to strip them of their power and fuss at the board, but to retrain them. And if you have to bring in, sometimes boards think that even though you've got more training than some of the board trainers who come in, and I know that specifically in Indiana, but sometimes you have to bring in somebody who will do the talking for you. Because if it's somebody that's from more than 50 miles, they always say, what is an expert? An expert is somebody who lives more than 50 miles from here. Because that way you don't know them, you don't know anything about them, you don't know what their track record is. And often that is a problem. So you're going to see this particular graphic repeated multiple times as we go through this part of the session. And I want you to get a good understanding of it by looking specifically first at, there's a big blue line there. And that line is the line between governance and management. And this is a concept that is so incredibly important that you've got to put it in your head. Governance and management. Above the line are the things that school boards are responsible for. Below the line are things that the superintendent is responsible for. The superintendent, keep this in mind, is the only person who goes back and forth across that line. Nobody else should go back and forth. All right, so everybody else in the school district answers to the superintendent. But remember that while the superintendent has this unusual relationship in that they are partners with school boards, but the school boards are in charge of the governing part. Superintendents carry out, they're kind of the executive officer of the school board, and they carry out what the school boards want to have done. So it all starts with core beliefs. And before any board anywhere can do anything, they have to know what they believe. And that should be part of a visioning meeting. We talk some about mission and vision, and we probably don't talk nearly enough about it. Because in my opinion, if a school district has a clear sense of what their mission is, they're going to be successful. If they don't have that clear vision, they're never going to go anywhere. So we start with the core beliefs and commitments, then go to theories of action. In other words, how do you make change happen? And so in order to understand that, you have to go through this whole stack in the middle here, which is the roles, responsibilities, and relationships of the board, building blocks of reform governance, policy development, reform policies. And then that all, once you get to the point of reform policies that you've created, then it goes to the civic capacity. And then civic capacity is what's the community capable of? And then transition planning Transition planning is almost always there. Any board should have a plan in place for what they do next. And I think it's very smart if there are qualified people within a school district that school boards make sure that the superintendent is training them to move up the ladder should something happen. So, what exactly then are core beliefs and commitments? Well, this you have to know this is the most important part of this project. If you don't know what you believe, you never know where you're going, how you're gonna get there. And so here are some core beliefs that you as a superintendent have the right to insist upon the formulation of these core beliefs and commitments. You have the right to insist that the board does the work, and the work means making certain that you go through a belief and commitment process with your board. I don't care who you are and how quickly they have in the past, how recently in the past they've done this. It has to be something they're reminded of regularly. Number one, all children can learn. Now I'm going to say to you something that comes across as a little hard, but you need to hear it. And that is, if you do not believe as an administrator that you can make a difference to the point that you can change the life of a student and help them to become successful, that you can, if you don't believe that all children can learn, then you need to get out of this business and go sell cars or something. Um, you have to believe that all children can learn. And school boards struggle with that concept. But that's something that you have to lend your expertise and you have to teach them. It doesn't matter what level the student is performing at, they have to be able to grow. They have to believe that the school effect is significant and that school districts can become higher performing organizations. If you're on the school board of a district that has never been successful, you've got to change the thinking of the school board first. That school board is never going to be successful unless and until they get to the point where they understand that we can perform better than we are. And then three, they have to commit themselves to grade level performance and achievement to potential so that every student is reaching their level of potential and that achievement gap disappears. We have no valid reason for an achievement gap to exist. Now, I've heard people say, I've heard principals say, I've heard teachers say, well, if we could fix the parents, then we could be successful as a school district. Let's take that off the table, completely off the table, because you have to believe, the school board has to believe that every child can learn, every school district can be successful, and we are going to make it happen in our district. So it's one thing to have a belief, but if you just sit there in your bathtub full of belief, then nothing ever happens. You know, I always think when I think of leaders in bathtubs, I always think of Winston Churchill, who arguably was one of the great leaders in the history of the world. He would sometimes hold meetings while he was in his bathtub. Now, please, that is so crazy. Uh, he absolutely loved baths. So wherever he went, he made sure if he had to stay overnight somewhere, it had to have a good bathtub. Um, I'm not saying that's a great thing, but I'm saying you're not going to sit in that theoretical bathtub with all of your beliefs and ideas. You have to put it into action. And the theory of action dictates how the policy works. All right. So recognizing that, you have to have these levers for change. Policy leadership, in which school boards create, pass, and follow policies. I'm going to remind you what I always say about policies. If you work in a place that has a bad policy, it is not your option to ignore that policy, period. the policy's been voted on by the board, you are responsible to follow it. Second thing is superintendent selection. The primary role of the board is to hire, assess, evaluate, keep happy the superintendent. Now, on the flip side of that, the role of the superintendent is they have to keep the board happy. And then the third thing is one that we don't see being used much at all right now. And this is a time not to sit back and whine about how things are going, but instead, it is a time for us to know that we have a great product in American public schools. And therefore, we have to help people understand that some things that they do to public schools tear us apart. We're looking at budget proposals right now from the US government to take apart the Department of Education. Some people say, well, that's all right. They're going to give the money back to the state. Then you have a state like Indiana where they have demonstrated by their actions time and time again they don't like public schools. So in that case, what's our responsibility as school board members? We have to speak up. If I'm a school board member, that's my job. If I am a superintendent, I'm going to teach the school board how they can advocate for the school district because they don't innately know that. So, make sure I'm in the right place here. Okay. This is the most violated part of this entire module that we're getting ready to talk about. And you can't talk about a school board and superintendent without talking about these things: roles, responsibilities, and relationships. This is so important, folks, because this is where we talk about the line. School board lives and operates above the line. They cannot deal with the day-to-day because they are not educators. You're fortunate if you happen to have an attorney on your school board because they can advise on matters of school law if they happen to have studied school law. Not all attorneys are good school law attorneys. But understand it is critically important, and I'm going to say this again, critically important for the school board to understand its job is to stay above the line and not ever to cross it, not to tell principals, hey, you know what, if you ever have a problem with this superintendent, let me know. I'll take care of it for you. That's not what is supposed to happen. And principals and administrators and teachers and support people don't need to be going to school board members because the school board members exist for the public's input. That's what makes one of the things that makes us public schools is that we have school boards. That sounds funny because you think, oh crap, if that's true, what kind of shape are we in? But understand that if the board knows its job, it's going to stay above that line in the governance area, and the superintendent will cross the line back and forth. By that, I mean the superintendent then not only goes into the governance aspect of it, but also then takes it back down across the line and spreads it through the district. The entire district has to know and believe. The only time I've ever been in a district that I saw that consistently done was under the leadership of Dr. Wendy Robinson, Fort Wayne Community Schools. And they had missed, and I've told this story so many times, but it's still so true. They had failed on a $500 million referendum that they wanted to much needed work in, it's a large school district, a lot of buildings. And this referendum failed because it was questioned. It was petitioned against by the people because they said it's too much money, we can't afford it. And besides, why should we pay so much money for a district that's failing? So the superintendent then taught the board that the first place we're going to start on this, and they actually use this model that's in this book. They use this model of reform governance. And so the superintendent became the person who went back and forth across that line and helped them. The board contributed to this process by constructing 3 or 4 goals, and then each month, every single thing that was on the agenda had to pertain to one of those 4 goals. If it didn't pertain to those 4 goals, then it wasn't appropriate board action for them. And I have to say that the biggest reason why this district was successful in following reform governance was because of the school board president they had, who served for 10 years as school board president. And I liked him. I still like him. He's a great guy. He's no longer serving in board leadership just because he decided that 10 years was enough and he was going to move on to other things. But I will tell you that during the 10 years that he was in charge of the board knew what its mission was, the board was committed to its mission, and the board worked well to support that superintendent. I asked Mark one time, I said, Mark, I always had this feeling that even though you got along really well, at least in public, with the superintendent, my guess is that did not come easily. And he laughed and he said, "You're right. It did not." He said, "Behind closed doors, Dr. Robinson and I would fight like cats and dogs. But once we stepped through that doorway and we were board members acting in public, I acted in one with the superintendent. If there something came up that she needed a reprimand, it was never, ever done in public." And so he understood very clearly what his job was. I'm going to talk about how do you build board governance. And there are a couple of things here and this is the regular work of the board, but these are things that you have to do. The first is board meetings. And board meetings are incredibly important things because that's how we stay transparent. It's how people know what's going on. And we also have this wonderful thing, which is required by Indiana law, and I believe should always be part of the public school meeting, and that is public comment. There should be opportunities for the public to make comment. Now, do you need to have time limits? Yes. Do you need to restrict people what they're talking about? That's up to you. Some districts have passed a requirement, made it policy, that the only thing that can receive public comment is something they're actually going to do in the board. So if you have a topic you want to talk about which has nothing to do with what the board is studying right now, or what's before the board in a board meeting, then it should not be allowed to come up. There should be a clear agenda. The agenda should be formulated by, are you ready? Not just the cabinet, not just the superintendent, but the superintendent in conjunction with the board president. And that's the way it should be. The next is, as you are creating this board, which is going to do such important things, you should be having workshops with your board. Now, I'm going to tell you, who you bring in makes all the difference in the world to do training for your board. I have done some board training. I thoroughly enjoy it. I would do it again in a heartbeat. So keep that in mind if you're looking for somebody in the future who would be the person who can train your board to know the right things to do. I would love to come in and work with your school board because an effective school board is one of the best things any school district can have. It's also one of the best things any superintendent can have. And that happens in the way of workshops. These workshops, if it's considered professional development, can be done in closed session. They do not have to be done in public. And because that it fits the Indiana Sunshine Laws, which says that you can't conduct business without it being done in public. Well, professional development is definitely one of those things that should be part of a closed session board meeting because sometimes board members don't get it and they have to be trained. They have to understand things. The third thing is committees. Every board should have committees that deal specifically with things because you don't want the board, and this is one area where a school board member might be considered as crossing that blue line, and that is when they serve on a committee. But remember, when they serve on committees, they should be there for information gathering purposes, not just to hear themselves talk or not to campaign for office. The committees are set up to do something. There might be a transportation committee that looks at working with the transportation director, deciding how all things transportation work. There should be a finance committee, which helps to determine, well, what about our school budget this year? What do we functionally look at so that we're putting on paper, if it's something that's important to us, we're going to fund it. And then how do we fund it? Then the last thing, the structure and processes of the board. We're going to talk about that. That will be our discussion for the next couple of weeks. Now, it's likely that most policies are routine policies that just enable the board to work. These don't have to consume all the time of the board. A lot of people, a lot of school districts use a board policy company. One in here that functions in Indiana is Neola, and they will every year after the General Assembly finishes, after the laws have been changed and passed, they look at all of your policies once again and make sure that you have policies that cover every single section of what the General Assembly, the legislature, has done, because every year education is number one on their topic list. So what's the process? Let's say you want to get a policy change. Most of the time, the ideas to change that policy come from the superintendent. How does the superintendent get the ideas? From people talking to them. A good superintendent listens to teachers and listens to principals and doesn't believe that they're the smartest person in the room. And I always tell people, right or wrong, if you feel like constantly you are the smartest person in the room, first thing you got to do is change rooms. Because if you're always the smartest person in the room, you got a problem there. Second thing is, if you think you're the smartest person in the room, let me help you with that. Go in, stand in your bathroom, look in the mirror, look at the person that's looking back at you, and say, you don't know everything, so you can't do it all. Second step usually has broad input. Like, if you're going to create a policy, there are sample policies for everything. Not only that, this is one of these places where artificial intelligence can be really good. You can say, type into one of these Claude AI or Chat GPT or something and say, create for me a policy that covers all necessary aspects on drug testing for students. And then in a matter of seconds, you would have a good framework from which you can start to build that policy. And remember that these policies should focus on the ends. What do you want to accomplish? What do you want students to be able to know and do? But it doesn't necessarily dictate how they get there, because the getting there is something that goes, we come back to the blue line again. Getting there, the creation of the policies up here in the governance area, the implementation of the policy with board or district guidelines is down here. So the board is not responsible to implement, they are responsible to create. And they should only be as specific as necessary. Now, there are some people that disagree with me on this, but let me tell you why. You've got to keep it broad because things happen, and you don't want to have to keep coming back to the board year after year after year to get a policy change on X, whatever X item is. But you don't want to have to keep doing that. So you want to make the board policy broad enough so it covers things and then allows for the management to do the work. Reform policies are different from routine policies. So we're talking two completely different animals here. A reform policy is used to transform your district to advance the board's theory of action. Now, most of the time, the board does not know enough how to create a theory of action on their own. But there typically are some people that are, into this a lot more than others. Sometimes they're former educators or attorneys or whatever. Understand that your biggest job besides hiring the superintendent, the board's primary biggest job, is to develop and approve reform policies. And these policies work on the structure, the incentives, the culture of the district. Now, that's a mouthful. How in the world does a reform board, no matter how smart they are, know how to create great policies which will lead to great success? Here are some of the answers. Read widely in school reform literature. School board members who do not read should not get reelected. They have no place in being a board member. 2, they have to know what's working and not working in districts that are successful. 3, they have to know their own theory of action. How do we work? And 4, interestingly, they have to be master politicians. School board is a political issue. However, it should not be a partisan political issue. And by that, I mean that while school boards function in the realm of politics, it should not give in to politics and give in to thinking about, well, I'm going to do this so that it ensures that I get reelected. Reform governance means more than leading the district. It means leading the community. Board leaders and superintendent must educate the public, starting with business leaders and elected officials, and reaching out to nonprofit and religious leaders, civic clubs, parent groups, and every center of influence in the district. Community leaders must understand and embrace the board's core beliefs, commitments, and theory of action. Eventually, a majority of the voters must believe that it's moving in the right direction. Now, let me give you a for example. Something that we get wrong sometimes. We're probably going to be getting wrong for a while here. Sometimes the community doesn't understand a certain perspective. I'll give you the topic of banned books. They say, we absolutely do not want any books that can have anything that contains harmful to children material. All right. Who should be deciding that? The professionals who teach the kids, not the board's place to get into that. However, if they want to create a policy about it, that's what they should do. But it should be founded on their core beliefs. If one of their core beliefs is inclusion, then that means you should allow books that talk about inclusion. Even though it's a dirty word today, diversity is not a dirty word. We should be accepting of all people who work in our district and everybody who lives in our district. And then they have to be able to carry forward this goal, this idea, so that it can work for the school board and then work for the district. Now, as we get almost to the end of this first 2 chapters, this is one of the things, transition planning, where a lot of boards fall apart. They do not look down the road. They don't anticipate the future. Good school boards have a 5-year plan and a 10-year plan. Can you realistically know what's going to be going on in 10 years? No, you cannot. However, you should still have that plan just because you need to have it. You need to have a broad, the first 5 years is pretty detailed. You can live with that. And you need to have, at this point in time, we're going to build this building. We're going to build this building, then 3 years later. All right, all of that's important. Or our goal as a district is to ensure that there are no gaps in our learning, and so that every child receives equity. In other words, what they need to be successful. Doesn't matter whether it means that this student gets more assistance, it means that they get what they need to be successful. So remember that if you have a district that functions because of one person and everybody lives and breathes off of what that one person does, if that person dies or retires or moves somewhere else, then you're sunk. School boards have to establish processes and procedures and policies for what they would do in the event that they lose a superintendent. It should not be a cult of personality. And I use that in quotes because it's a term that I've heard used before, but a district should not just be known because of the work of one person. It should be known by its overall success. And then the school board, then, their job is to make sure that they are looking to the future and thinking ahead and saying, you know what? Is it possible that we can train one of the people we have internally so that they can begin to move up and they can become superintendent? And I say a big yes to that, because that way, if you have an associate superintendent or assistant superintendent who is able to understand the workings of the board, then you want to develop that person, bring out their strengths, and allow them to become the kind of leader that if it's time to make a change, it's a natural transition. And with that, we've come to the end of this session. Thank you for your attention, and we will see you the next time around.